All right, this is our next chapter from Wise Words. This one is called Simon and the Fruit Vendor. Man, I don't have any of my kids listening today.
But I'll listen to it. Okay.
Oh, you listen to it over there?
Yeah.
Okay. Xavier's listening to it, but he's not in the camp. There once was a young man named Simon who wanted, as all young men do at one time or another, at least in fairy tales, to go into the world to make his fortune. Early one morning, Simon gathered his few belongings and went to say goodbye to his father. Father, I'm leaving home to go into the world to make my fortune, he said. Simon used precisely these words because he, like you, had been reading fairy tales all his life. His father looked out the window, smiling sadly as if remembering some event of the distant past. He drew a deep breath and spoke. Oh, very well, son, but stay a moment while I tell you some things I have learned. You may find them useful. You're going to the city? Yes, father. Then I must tell you there are some very dishonest fellows in the city. If anyone tempts you to follow evil, do not go with him. Do you promise? Yes, father. Let your eyes look directly ahead of you. Watch where your feet are walking. Buddy, hey, that's a little bit loud. Okay. Watch where your feet are walking. Do not turn to the right or the left. Then you will prosper. Do you understand? Yes, father. Simon looked out the window, how late it was getting, and he was still not on the road. And there are dishonest women as well. Be careful whom you choose as your companions. Do you swear? I do, father, the young man said, though he was only half listening. He waited for his father to say more. After a moment, he asked, is that all, father? Oh, that's all. Then I shall be going. Simon kissed his father, picked up his pack, and left. The city lay a 3-day walk to the north. On the first day, Simon passed an old man driving an ox cart. Going to the city? Asked the old man. Simon nodded. The old man said, hop on the wagon here. I'm going there myself. I'm selling pies at the fair. There was something strangely frightening about the old man's crackling voice. Remembering his father's words, the young man kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead of him. No, thank you. I shall walk. Without stopping, he walked straight past the ox cart and toward the city. On the second day, Simon passed a group of men gathered on the side of the road. One who had a black bag over his shoulder called him as he walked by, asking if he were headed to the city. Simon stopped in the road. Yes, I am. Why do you ask? Yeah, well, see, we're going to the city too, to make some money. Another of the men snickered, and the speaker slapped him with the back of his hand. We need at least one more to work with us, he added, glaring at his companions. Simon cast a sideways glance. Whoa, what kind of work? This time the man with the bag over his shoulder snickered, and his fellows went, well, you're the curious one. I can't tell you how much, only you'll make money. A lot of money. Simon remembered his father's words, which for a few moments he had completely forgotten. Looking straight ahead, he answered, No, thank you. I must go to the city myself. He walked straight past the gang of thieves, for that is what they were, and on toward the city. The sun was beginning to go down. Yeah, they were thieves. So it's good that Simon stayed away from them, right?
Because they're not workers. They're
what?
trying. He's telling them.
Does Sophie need help?
He's telling him to. They're telling him to come to. He's telling them, "Can I have your money?"
Yeah. No. So you can do it. Okay. She's okay. The sun was beginning to go down when Simon arrived at the gates of the city on his third day of his journey. At the gate were two young women selling goods from wagons and shouting to everyone who passed by. The young man stopped to see what they were selling. The first young one was tall and slender as a tree, wore a ragged dress, gray as dry earth. Small animals and birds huddled at her feet as if seeking shade in her shadow. Her face was smeared with mud, and she had dirt under her fingernails, as if she had been digging in the garden. Fruit! Fruit for sale! She cried when she saw Simon. What kind of fruit do you have? He asked politely. I have every kind of fruit you can imagine. It's the most delicious fruit you will ever eat.
So she's trying to get him to buy the fruit?
Buy the fruit, yeah. Come, buy my fruit. Simon peered into the wagon. The apples and pears looked old and bruised. The grapes were shriveled like raisins, the plums like prunes. He looked at the fruit, and Simon realized the second young woman had come up behind him. My, he heard her say, what a handsome young man you are. The boy blushed and looked around. When he looked up, he saw before him the most beautiful face he'd ever seen. Her skin was smoother than oil, her hair black as a raven. She was wearing a purple dress as a princess might. At that very moment, the boy forgot his father's instructions. What are you selling? He stammered. Gold, silver, jewels. Her words were as sweet and thick as brown honey. Come, look, and buy. The boy peered into her wagon. It was filled with trinkets and jewelry that sparkled so brightly in the late afternoon sun that he had to cover his eyes. Do they please you? The woman asked. When he nodded, she said, I have many more jewels at home. Would you like to come see? Before Simon could answer, the fruit vendor interrupted. Don't go with her. She's dangerous. And the men who follow her come to great harm. The boy looked at her with a puzzled frown. Besides, she continued, my fruit is better than gold. Come and buy from me. But the woman dressed like a princess answered, don't listen to her. Look at me. Do I look dangerous? Believe what you see and look at her. She's dirty and dressed in rags, and her fruit is old and dry. She's just mad because she cannot sell her rotten fruits. But I sell my jewels to everyone. She's jealous because I have more buyers than she. So, Xavier, which do you think Simon should follow, the girl who sells the fruit or the girl who sells the jewels?
The fruit.
Why?
Because he thinks it's rotten, but what if it's not really rotten?
Okay, you should follow the girl who sells the fruit
Yeah.
because her fruit might not be rotten.
Yeah.
Okay. Simon thought for a moment, then laughed at the fruit vendor. Your fruit better than gold? I have seen better fruit rotted on the ground. And turning to the jewel seller, he said, I would like to see more jewels. Please take me to your house. So taking hold of the wagon, he followed her through the gate. As he walked by, the boy heard from the fruit seller call to him, You will come to harm. Turn back. He was not listening. She cried again, Remember to this day, I called to you and you refused. I stretched out my hand to help you, but you paid no attention. Trouble will come upon you like a storm and a whirlwind. You should have listened to me. Then I would have given you everything you desired. You should have listened. Yeah, don't mind her, the jewel seller said. They turned the corner. She's a fool who thinks she's wise. As they turned the corner, she stumbled and nearly fell. Simon caught her by the arm. Thank you, she said. I'm afraid I'm unsteady my feet sometimes. Could you please hold me up? Simon held her arm and pushed the wagon as they walked up and down the twisting streets of the city. As they walked by, the boy kept glancing at the princess that walked beside him. To think that she was not only... Well, she looks like a princess. To think that she was not only beautiful, but very rich. Perhaps, he thought, she will fall in love with me, as I've already fallen in love with her. The sky was dark by the time they turned into the narrow alley. At the end of the alley, they came to a set of broken steps that stretched down to a basement. At the bottom, the door was barely visible. Is this your home? Simon asked nervously. Yes. Come down the steps. I will show you around. You do want to see more jewels, don't you? The boy felt a sharp pain as if an arrow had pierced his heart. He was not sure whether the pain was love or fear or both or something else altogether. Looking at the starlit sky to gather his courage, he followed the princess down the darkness. She unlocked the door and handed him a lamp. "Go in," she commanded. The boy ducked through the small door into a damp cellar. He held the lamp, expecting to be dazzled by a room full of gold and silver jewels. Instead, the walls were covered with something shiny and green. A rat scampered behind a pile of garbage. The sickening odor of death was so strong Simon could almost see it. Propped against the far wall was a human skeleton. Does that sound like a good place to be in? No. Simon turned, opening his mouth to cry out. Before he could, he heard the heavy sound of the door closing, the scrape of a rusty lock, and the light dance of footsteps ascending the broken stairs outside. He ran to the door and tried the handle. It didn't move. He pounded and cried for help, but no answer came. In a few moments, the lamp flickered and went out. Simon sank to the floor and began to cry. As he touched the floor, Simon felt something hard next to his hand. He picked it up and held it under his nose. The smell of moldy bread burned his nostrils, and he threw the loaf across the room. "Oh, I wish I had remembered my father's instructions. I wish I had listened to the fruit vendor instead of wanting to look at the gold and silver, but I wouldn't listen. And look where it got me." He cried until he could cry no longer. Then, being as exhausted as he was afraid, he fell asleep. When Simon awoke, the door was framed by a dim line of sunlight. He was enormously hungry. Crawling on his hands and knees, he was able to find the loaf of bread he had tossed away the night before. Holding his breath, he broke off a piece, chewed, and swallowed it. He imagined what he'd be doing if he were at his father's house. Breakfast would just be beginning, and the table would be nearly breaking with a load of eggs, sausage, bowls of fruit, cups of milk, bread, rolls, and still warm and fragrant from the oven. "I have nothing but a moldy loaf of bread," he thought, and began to cry again. Through days and nights, Simon wept and slept and ate moldy bread. 3 or 4 nights later, he was awakened about midnight by the sound of scratching on the wall across the room. At first, he thought it was a rat. The sound grew louder and louder. He huddled in the corner, his mind a whirlwind of fear. The scratching stopped, and in the dark, he sensed that a figure had emerged from the wall. He stared across the room. "Who's there?" he whispered, his voice crackling. The figure crept closer and closer. Just when he was about to scream, however, a gentle voice said, "Don't be afraid. I've come to help." And Simon recognized the fruit vendor, whom he had met at the city gate days before. At the sound of her voice, his heart came alive with hope. So who's coming to rescue him?
The fruit vendor. I knew he should have gone with the fruit vendor.
Yeah, he should have gone with the fruit vendor, right?
Mm-hmm.
He strained his ears, hoping she would speak again. For a few moments, he heard nothing, and began to think he might have imagined it all. Then she came near and touched his hand. "You are filthy," she said quietly. Next thing Simon knew, cold water was streaming over his hands and head. He closed his eyes, and it flooded over his face and into his mouth and down his back. When he opened his eyes, the room seemed lit by a warm white light. The young woman before him was no longer dressed in rags, but in a flowing dress that seemed to fill the whole room. The dress was white as light and sparkled with jewels of every description. Like a bride adorned for her husband, was the thought that crossed Simon's mind. Before he could even thank her, she offered him a brownish, bruised pear. Realizing that even a brown pear was better than moldy bread, Simon took the fruit greedily. Its taste was sweeter than honey in the honeycomb. Its juice warmed his throat like wine and trickled down his chin. Laughing in amazement, Simon said, "This is the best fruit I've ever tasted." The fruit vendor nodded with a grave smile. "Eat quickly, put on your shoes. We must leave before she returns." "Why did she bring me here?" he asked as he struggled with his boots, his mouth still full of fruit. And it's well known that even the most polite people may forget their manners after being imprisoned for days with nothing but moldy bread to eat. "Well, do you think she could afford those expensive clothes by selling jewelry at the city gate?" "Oh, no, she is not what she appears to be. She is not rich because she's a seller of jewels. She's a seller of men. I was to be a slave, Simon whispered to himself. You still might be if you don't hurry, the fruit vendor said earnestly. Simon followed her to the other side of the room where he found a tunnel through the wall. Slender as a tree, she easily climbed to the hole and crawled away into the darkness. But the tunnel seemed too small for Simon. He hesitated for a moment. He did not like tight spaces anyway. Still, knowing he had to escape, he entered the tunnel, where he squirmed and scratched and slowly followed her through the long passageway. After what seemed like hours of labor, the tunnel turned upward. The growing spot of light appeared in front of them. When they climbed out of the tunnel, the morning sun was shining overhead. They were in a park in the middle of the city, and birds sang in the trees and fluttered around the fruit vendor, landing on her shoulders and pulling playfully at her hair. The green hillside shimmered with dew. For Simon, it was like being reborn into a new world. Come, said the fruit vendor. You are staying in the city. We must find you a change of clothes and a place to live. Taking Simon by the hand, she led him up the hill, and they disappeared over the sunlit peak. And I've heard reports from very reliable sources, mind you. They were soon married and lived happily ever after. The moral, from Proverbs 1, verses 20 to 23. Wisdom shouts in the street. She lifts her voice in the square. At the head of the noisy street, she cries out. At the entrance of the gates of the city, she utters her sayings. How long, O naive ones, will you love simplicity? Turn to my reproof. Behold, I will pour my spirit on you. I will make my words known to you. Proverbs 1, verses 20 to 23. So in the story, Xavier, who was the one who was crying out to Simon in the street and saying, "No, you should listen to me"?
It was.
Was the girl selling jewels or fruit? Who's the one you're supposed to listen to?
The fruit vendor.
The fruit vendor, yeah. And so, was there any Bible stories that reminded you of?
The one where it was one of the Bible guys who got taken prisoner.
Okay, yeah, there's Bible stories where guys get taken prisoner. What about the story where there's that son who wants his money from his father, the prodigal son?
Yeah, that guy.
Yeah, it's like that story too.
Yeah. He's the one who gets taken prisoner.
No, I don't think he gets taken prisoner in that story. Simon did, though.
Yeah.
All right. That's the story for today. We'll see you guys later.